Okay, good morning, everybody. My part of this is going to be, at this point, is going to be short and sweet. You'd be glad to hear. I suppose one of the things I want to say is, obviously, we're here to look at data and information. When a survivor walks through the door of a rape crisis centre for the first time, that's an act that takes huge courage and tenacity on their part. And the first thing I think that they want is to actually be believed. And so that's what we're here really about today, is the belief we hold for survivors of sexual violence who for so long were not listened to and weren't heard. Our database, we realised just really recently, is actually 20 years old. I can remember the early, as can Clíona, I'm sure, the early torturous days of trying to create it and gather data, meaningful data of some kind. And so after 20 years, we finally got around to naming it. So we're now calling it Mosaic, which is many experiences building one picture. And it's a database that we're very proud of. Everybody concerned has worked hard to develop it over the years and to feed the information into it. And really what it is it's the voice of the survivors. It's their experiences. It's the stories, their lives that they have come in and shared with us. At great pain to themselves. I'm often struck by how unfair in a way it is that nothing happens around sexual violence until survivors come forward and tell. And that's not an easy thing to do, and it's not a route that many of them can choose to do publicly. It is very tough, but nothing changes unless they do come forward and tell their stories. And so that's what our database is about, is gathering their stories in a way that's safe for them, and telling what the story of sexual violence in this country has been and is today, and trying to change that picture as we move forward over the last 20 years and into the future. As it said, this slide just says it quite simply. Evidence is the bridge between awareness and action. And we're very aware of the need for good, clean, robust data held to a very high standard in our sector. And obviously, Clíona and Sally will be speaking more about that as we go through this event. My final piece here is to thank everybody who's been involved in the creation and the development of this database, right from back when it started through to today. And these are the people concerned, the rape crisis centres who input, and other organisations who input data, our partners, Storm, JDK Design and Castlebridge, who help us look after our data protection concerns. We're very grateful to all of those. We're grateful to you for coming here today. We're very proud of our database, and we're very proud of the information that we're able to disseminate from it. And we hope that you find it as meaningful as we do. So, on that note, we would also like to thank every survivor in 2024 and in previous years who has contributed their lives, in essence, to the information that we present here today. As I said, we really see ourselves, we're survivor-centred, and we see ourselves as being a voice for survivors who are maybe not able to be a voice for themselves, but also to really show the true picture of what sexual violence is in Ireland.
So I'm just going to frame what we're about to talk about here a little bit for you. Sally's going to do the deep dive, so I've got the easier job, hopefully, the simpler job. But Sally has laid this out. One of the beautiful things about how we've been working together and how the skills around data have evolved across the whole network, from the DCOs, data collection officers in every centre, the managers, through to the support that Sally provides, is just how sophisticated we can get at this stage and at this stage of maturity of the database. So the first thing is, of course, when you're talking about data, is definitions. And so just to be clear, we're focused in on two very specific things, a very specific thing for this launch, not all of the data. All of the data is in the report, which will be online and which you have in your hands. But we're talking today about the disclosure gap. When we say disclosure, we do not mean reporting. These words are not interchangeable for us. Disclosure is, what we're talking about there is the first time that a survivor tells another human being. That could be their friend, it could be their partner, it could be their mother. Or other people. Reporting is very specifically when we're reporting to the authorities. So generally the Gardaí, but it might be TUSLA as well. Now it could well be that a first disclosure, for example, might well be at the Garda station, so it might be reporting as well. But these are distinct terms and we're using them very distinctly. So the other piece of context here is that we are very lucky to have an up-to-date population prevalence survey in Ireland. The CSO's SVS, Sexual Violence Survey, came out in 2022. What that means for administrative data like ourselves, because of course our data is measuring people who've walked through the door of these rape crisis centres. And we have a sufficient number of people in this data set for it to be for there to be generalisable national findings to be and to be conclusions to be drawn from this data. And when you sit it, the power of this is when you sit it beside the prevalence study, you can really begin to look at the questions of actually who's in the door, who should be in the door, who's not in the door, who's still outside, and what do they, what can we tell, what can we say about those people, and what can we learn about those people in terms of changing that picture. So it really equips us to really move to action in terms of access and closing the disclosure gap. So just very briefly, the headline, some of the headline stats, this is just to introduce you gently to the stats on disclosure. Sally, as I say, will take us into more detail. So, for example, 90% of survivors, 90.8% of survivors had disclosed to a trusted person prior to coming to the Rape Crisis Centre. So we've now got questions about the pathway of referral and what that looks like. We've also got a whole set of questions about what does that look like? Who are the supports? Who are the trusted people out there that are that first disclosure for survivors? We've also, on the other end of the scale, got 20.6% of survivors coming to rape crisis centres who took over 10 years to find someone to tell. That might have been the rape crisis centre, but it might have been someone in their lives, at least a decade. So that's a long time for them to hold that in silence and unheard. The other piece of headline data I'll give you here on this issue is, and this again is a new piece of information we have because of the sophistication of the system. Because we're able to connect, we collect around incidents and we're able to connect those across two individuals, we're able to really pull out and look at the survivors who've experienced multiple incidents across a lifetime and what that looks like. So as you see here, 20% of the survivors coming to rape crisis centres have experienced multiple incidents. That's a really significant percentage there. And it begs the question, if we have is there a relationship between finding someone to disclose to and continuing to be vulnerable to be targeted? So again, these are stats that beg questions of us. I'll leave you with three sort of the idea here is of what happens next. We have this data, we have this evidence base, we have the prevalence, we have this level of sophistication, and we can drill right down into this administrative data from rape crisis centres and survivors. So what's next? And the good data, of course, what it does is it hones our questions. It begs more questions and it hones our questions. And so what we're talking about, the first thing we need here, well actually I've skipped a slide here, because of course the first thing, if we're closing the disclosure gap, is we need to be clear that we're there for people, when people come forward, that the services they need, whatever they may be, are there for people. Now, because we've been collecting this for 20 years, we can look back, and something that we notice gets lost year on year when we're putting this data out is that we look at annual increments. And we said, no, that we're missing something here. And we looked back and we said, okay, since 2017, right up to 2024, the increase in appointments by these rape crisis centres was 48%. That's a massive, massive increase. Now, I can also tell you that additional funding started to go into the sector from 2018, since the huge cuts that happened in 2008. So 2018 was the beginning of the restoration of funding. And you can see the service delivery matched that funding, but it also was that need was there. Survivors are waiting for that service to be available to them, and the waiting lists are still there. The need is still there. We still need expansion. We've also, in that first corner here, we've begun to track how awareness raising begins to change, or might be changing, the way that survivors are accessing. So the closing, hopefully, of the disclosure gap through awareness raising and how that impacts on services. Now, we will be tracking this year on year to see if this pattern is maintained and is stronger, to really verify that pattern. The other piece we need, of course, is when we find the interesting questions, the more focused questions, that we have investment in research, that we're doing the research, we're working with all our partners across research to make sure that these survivor stories gathered in this way with survivors' consent really get out there and go to work in terms of the research community. And the next step, of course, after that is once we have those questions, once we've answered those questions, is putting that into action. And for us, that is about how do we target the people across society appropriately and specifically to make a difference in terms of closing the disclosure gap. So I'm going to hand you over to Sally, who's going to take you much deeper into the data.
Gormagov. So as Anne's mentioned, this year we kind of reached a turning point in terms of the technology that we have. So we have the privilege of marrying 20 years of data capture with the modern tools that are available now, and Mosaic has evolved to one of the most comprehensive and enduring data sets of sexual violence in Ireland. You have the reports in your hands, or they're online if you're watching this on video, and you can see our headline data. This is, for us, is about, again, the benefits that we offer to the centres that use Mosaic, as well as what we can do with that data. So the centres are able to have a specifically designed system that they enter into that is in line with their own processes. We work together for best practice on processes to get it on data definition, so we have consistency. We drive that consistency. We run joint controller agreements and take on a lot of that responsibility with them so that they can benefit from focusing on survivors, and we focus on the technology and the legalities. We then aggregate that data, as has been mentioned, to tell the stories. And that's really what we're focused on. As being survivor focused, we want to be able to draw out these stories, and we want to be able to pass them on into something that's meaningful and evidenced for policy and for changes in society. Where our system is somewhat different to what is typically seen in rape crisis centres nearly everywhere is we break it down into, most places have person-related figures, activity-related figures, but we go a little bit deeper on the incident-related figures. So we capture multiple incidences, as Clíona pointed out, so we are able to tell who has experienced more than one incident. So that could get lost in crime data, for instance, because it's focused on the charge rather than what's happened to the individual in their lifetime. So we are able to tell the story of their lifetime experience. We also track individual perpetrators, and for one who does experience multiple instances, if there is a perpetrator that shows up multiple times, and we're able to analyse that somewhat deeper, but at the moment that's not something we've gone very deep into as yet. So why this matters? So we know that no data source is perfect, and every data that does exist out there has its own purpose. And our purpose, our primary purpose, is providing support to survivors of rape and sexual violence. The data is captured during that process. We are able to dive a bit deeper to get a better understanding. So we also connect with the centres that use our system, and as I'm analysing the data and we're looking at trends that we're noticing, we validate that with the actual experiences of actual conversations that are happening with survivors. So we really have that close link to how the centres are operating, the challenges that they're facing, and what is coming out. So we're constantly checking for what we need to evolve with that very hands-on experience. So going back to the disclosure, so these two graphs are in your reports if you want to compare. They're on pages 25 and 26. So we're looking at the time to disclose as was broken down and who people first disclosed to. And I'm just going to take on a very quick how we broke these down further and how we can break these down further. So we've chosen for this just to look at the age group. So you can see there's two columns. We've got age when they started counselling versus age of the first incident. So straight away, without going into the detail, you can see that they're quite different. They already look different in what's prominent there. So if we break it down to the 0 to 12-year-olds, so under 13 at the age of the first incidents, and that's the biggest cohort of survivors in the data set of who we saw in 2013. And we can see over here, that's where we've got the 10 plus years before they disclosed. Again, that doesn't tell us before they saw us. That is available in the data. That's not something we've broken down in this particular point. We can see how prominent they are within the survivor set. And what we don't know is how many more are there. is this the tip of the iceberg? How far are we going? When we're talking about that length of time, how many people are still waiting and holding on to this information that we haven't managed to talk to yet and haven't sought help yet? Contrastly, we look at the second biggest cohort of survivors in the data of those saw us in 2024, and 21% of survivors who were aged 18 to 24 at the age of their first incident. So in a slightly positive way, we can see they are coming forward sooner. And that is welcome, and that is positive for their own work towards where they need to address what has happened to them. However, we don't know from the data that we have and from the restrictions of the data that we have is this still the tip of the iceberg? We know from the prevalence data that 8% of people who were surveyed by the CSO sought support of any kind. Is this still representative of the 8% and showing much more out there, or have we actually increased how many people are seeking services in that period? We do not have that answer right now, but it is, as Clíona alluded to, we have more questions and more things that we can look into to understand what is working and how we can do more. Similarly, we broke down who people spoke to. Now, these, again, the data I have available, when we compared the age groups, they all had a different profile. So we're just focusing on one because we do have a limited time today. But again, we're showing what we can see. So this is based on who the first part of disclosure were for those that were under 13 at the time. So we can see that friends and parents stay prominent at every period of time in terms of that first disclosure. There's nearly 50% in most cases. It's just this, that approximately teens to around age 22, where that drops a little bit, and there's other sources. Where we see that is interesting is that medical professionals over here are highest in those early years. So that tells us there might be more we can do. The medical professionals have been viewed as a safe place. And is there more we can do to make them better able to receive that information, better able to refer, better able to be supportive when they receive that information? We can see that partners are more prominent in, again, that period of teens to 20s, to the early 20s, so again, up to the age of 22. So that tells us that it's also children that are receiving this information potentially. So it's secondary schools, secondary education and tertiary education. We could be doing more for the people that are receiving this information and being appropriate supports, because what we don't have here is if this was a good experience or not. And finally, the one of going to Garda comes most prominent in that 2 to 5 years. So again, we're talking up to around 17 years of age, and the first person they're telling is a Garda. And it's, sorry, that one really affects me, of the idea of them being so young and walking into that Garda station on their own as the first person that they've told. And again, we don't know if it was a formal report, if this was in other settings, but it shows what we've been talking about in terms of accompaniment services and that being available, and not just being available, but people knowing that it is there for them and ready for them when they need it. So what does this tell us? That's just two very simple breakdowns of how we can go deeper, and we've got so many more questions just from those two. From the disclosure point of view, we need people to understand that anyone that they're coming into contact with could be holding on to that trauma, and we need so many more of us being safe people to receive that information and to point them in the direction that's suitable for them as individuals. From a data point of view, it shows us that when we look at aggregated data, as we tend to in this sector, we are losing the stories. We are solving big problems with a mesh of different individuals, and we're trying to solve the wrong thing because we haven't broken it down to see what groups have different experiences. And we're really looking forward to being able to break that down further and see what else we can see. So in line with that, we have a video here from Sophia, and sorry, I did have some tech stuff before, so bear with me, which talks about her own disclosure story.
My experience of disclosure happened when I was very young. When I was about 12 or 13, I disclosed and I wasn't believed. And then neighbours started telling me that they knew that the abuse was going on when I was a small baby. And obviously around that age, then I started using substances and stuff like that. So I was getting very angry and very aggressive in life. So I went and reported it again to social welfare, and I was being removed from the family home for making accusations and That's then when I thought to myself, it's just not worth the hassle. I'm not going to be believed. It's just not, it wasn't what I thought it would be. I thought I'd be believed straight away as I was self-harming. I was breaking my own bones. I was in and out of hospital. Anything I was doing as a cry for help wasn't being heard. I moved away from home at the age of 16. I went off, lived my life as normal. I thought my dad hadn't abused anybody else. I was wrong. My sister disclosed to me that he abused her as a child as well. So myself and my sister got together. We reported it to the guards, and that's when it all took off then. When I reached out, it wasn't because I felt I wanted support. As I said, I had just accepted this was my life. I tried counselling over the years, like different counsellors, and obviously because I never spoke about my father, I was always like told I had anxiety, had depression, had like I was put on medication that I didn't even need, because all that was wrong, not all that was wrong with me, but what was wrong with me inside, I was just a little girl crying out for help, crying out for love, crying out for support, crying out for safety, for comfort, for everything that a little child needs from the people who's supposed to give it to them, their parents. But when it came to when I disclosed at the age of 27, it was out of anger. It was out of like, you did this to other people. You can't destroy any more lives. When I did disclose and I got engaged with the guard that was over my case, Thomasina, she was amazing. She was the one that said it to me, look, Sophia, get yourself counselled. And she also told my sister the same, because she was dealing with both of us. And my counsellor, Sonia, was amazing. This woman just like, she made me feel normal. She made me feel safe, non-judgmental. She helped me with the acceptance of what went on as well, like, but that was very early in my healing years. I've evolved so much since then over the years with obviously different experiences in life and stuff like that. But that really was the start of my healing journey, was the counselling. As I say, I used to run up the stairs every week to tell her how I was doing, to tell her what came up, to tell her how I was feeling. And it's like I was taking, every time I went up those stairs, I was taking back that control of my life. It was powerful. It really was. If I had someone in my life like Sonia at the age of 14, 15 and 16, life would have been very different, because as I said, I went out into the world at 16 years of age with no self-respect, no boundaries, no self-love, no nothing. I went into toxic relationship after toxic relationship. I let people use me, abuse me. I used myself. I abused myself. Because I wasn't shown any of that from an early age, I didn't know any of that existed. That's where the likes of rape crisis centres are so important, to help people understand their trauma, to help people feel normal, feel safe, feel wanted, feel loved, and just feel supported and not judged. That abuse, that was the creator of all that trauma in my life, because I know it was from the trauma, because every time I healed from the trauma, them feelings were less and less and less and less. The difference between me and Steph definitely was, Steph felt a lot more shame. She felt a lot more guilt. Steph's mental health was very bad. Steph was tortured. Her mental health was tortured. Like she was in a really bad place for many years. Like she found it so hard to talk, even to say it. It was, she couldn't get it out. And she held all that in, and by her holding it all in, it destroyed her life. It brought her to an early grave. She passed away at 32 because the demons in her head just got the better of her. Offloading, talking, speaking about it, getting it out of the pit of your stomach it's hard, it's challenging, but it's so rewarding. It's letting go of all that pain. I'm not bringing it with me anymore. I'm ready to let go, because I know when I let go, it's no longer mine.
You're a hard act to follow, Sophia. So now I'm going to bore you with the science bit, as Jennifer Aniston would say. Although I'll try my hardest not to bore you too much. Okay, so really great to see the report, and I have tried as much as I can to link in with what I'm hearing this morning. But as I was listening to everything, I was changing my mind about what I was going to say to you. So I guess the roadmap of where we're going is, and in the book, which is free because of the European Research Council, everybody, thank God for Europe. I talk a lot about trauma being a social phenomena, and I think many of us think of trauma as being something that is very physical, and or indeed psychological. So when I say trauma is a social phenomena, I'm not saying it isn't all those things as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about risk and resilience, and then I think we've already heard something of the human cost, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And I think there is also an important economic and political cost that when Clíona is trying to make people change their ways, perhaps at a higher level, it is worth reminding ourselves that there are costs in terms of money and politics. So I think if COVID taught us one thing, it taught us that the groups that we are a part of really matter to how we manage stress and trauma. So early on in COVID, we had people telling us we were all in the one boat. But of course, it's very different if you're in a big cruise liner of a boat as against Jean Ilamy going off to Tory. So there is a very clear difference in how you experience something based on the group you're a part of. And one of the things that caused incredible trouble during COVID, and particularly in the US, but also closer to home in Northern Ireland, was this idea that if you stayed at home, you would be safe. But of course, if you were a victim of domestic abuse or child abuse, staying at home and not having a school to go to, for instance, coming and going from the house, neighbours in and out, actually amplified your risk rather than reduced it. So membership of a particular family, membership of a particular community, it really matters to how we experience different things in life. And here is a slide that if one of my students gave it to me, I would probably fail them. So this is something called My World in Data. And if you look along the bottom here, and this is why the poor student would fail, it shows you that the colours are different, contingent on the percentage. Do you see? So for women, have you experienced sexual violence in 2022? This is world statistics. It goes up as high as 10% for red, for the girls, but it only goes up as far as 2.5% for the boys. So that non-equivalence would get you probably 0 in my research methods class, but I couldn't figure out how to change it so they would both be 10%. But what it does tell you is if you're born a girl, you are much higher risk of being a victim of sexual violence than if you're a boy. Equally, it doesn't mean that if you're a boy, you will never be a victim of sexual violence. You cannot say the inverse is true. And it also says be careful which country you're born in. There are some countries where you're much more likely to be a victim of sexual violence. And this is even when we know that disclosure is increasing in Western society. So people, maybe with a little bit less shame and guilt, we hope, as time goes on, people are more likely to disclose. In what may seem like an unrelated slide, this is probably the most significant piece of research that has been done in terms of public health in the last 20 years, which shows that social relationships are more important to your health than, for instance, smoking. But yet, smoking is the thing that we all talk about. We all talk about the importance of not smoking. In fact, we had the very conversation this morning about giving up cigarettes. Smoking cessation, alcohol consumption, all of these things, having a flu vaccine, are all less important to your health than strong social connections. But we very rarely hear anybody on the radio advising us to improve our social connections. And one of the things that not disclosing does, or indeed disclosing to the wrong person who says, you did, yeah, is that actually it reduces your sense of connection. So in much of the work that we have been doing as part of this ERC grant, is we've been trying to look at why it is and how people were responded to when they disclosed. And many people aren't believed, worse than not being believed, they can be put back into the situation. Many people don't disclose themselves because of shame and guilt. They cannot find a way to disclose. So they've actually internalized these myths about, was it what you wore? What kind of a precocious child were you? Kind of really strange things. And in fact, in some of the research that we've done with victims in Ireland, you find people who, had very unusual behaviour as children, and people, rather than engaging with very unusual behaviour in an 8-year-old, ask the 8-year-old to leave whatever activity it is that they're participating in, rather than interrogating why an 8-year-old is so sexualised. So I think these kinds of things are really important. So I think for the people who don't disclose, imagine carrying that around with you, that the people who are closest to you in your life don't know something really big about you. They don't know the thing. And for those who do disclose and get a bad response, actually it can completely disconnect them from their family. So the implications for them are in their community, or maybe their peer group, or whoever it is that is important in their lives. So I think this slide here actually tells us that most people are very resilient. And one of the things that we show in our work is that if you can get people reintegrated and reconnected in terms of their cardiac health, their immune health, in terms of their physical health, as well as their mental health, you can show that it's much better. So we've taken huge, big databases from various locations across the world and demonstrated that even people who have very serious adverse circumstances in childhood, if they become socially connected, their long-term health is much better, long-term physical health. That we kind of knew that in terms of mental health, but what we're beginning to show is that it matters to their cardiac health and their immune function. So if we want to think about countering the cost, one of the ways to do it is to do exactly what Clíona and the rape crisis are trying to do, is to get people reconnected, to get people feeling like they can talk and can therefore say things to Sophia like, what incredible courage and respect we all have for your journey. So there is a human cost if we don't, and some of it is in terms of physical health, and some of it is in terms of people who die. So I was very struck recently when, I don't know if any of you listened to a podcast that was called Doc on One about Stolen Sister. And in one of the very end episodes, there is a story of a girl who went to the guards after she was chased by these two men who are believed to have been the two men who abducted Elizabeth Plunkett, maybe, I think was the first girl that went missing. So this girl just about escaped into her house in Galway, and the next morning she went to the guards. And the guard said to her something to the effect of, A, did you get the license plate? Strangely, she didn't stop to take the plate down. And B, what were you doing out so late anyway? So she didn't, that was the end. Subsequently, another woman was killed. If that guard had behaved differently, there was a life to be saved there. And in conversation we're having with the guards now in terms of training, there are people who are coming forward and waiving their anonymity and talking about how disclosure was good and how their experience of the guards was good. And we're using that to kind of facilitate how people should respond when something is disclosed. So I think that's important. There's an economic cost to all of this. So in fact, trauma, would you believe, is the biggest single mental health problem and has the highest burden of disease of any mental health problem. It's estimated to cause about 4% of disability worldwide. So it is a hugely significant cost to our economy in terms of healthcare, in terms of not only mental health care, but also what I would call allostatic load, and you can use that term down the pub and sound very fancy later on, but in terms of wear and tear on your body. So it has a consequence in terms of healthcare for people and in terms of our own healthcare system. And the last thing I would say is that it really, and this is where our research is at the moment, is that it also has a political cost. To ignore people's anger, and I was really glad you used the word anger, because anger tends to be the thing that precipitates political action. So we have taken various Dáil debates about the mother and baby home and looked at how people are articulating what's going on in those debates. And mostly, anger is what causes people to go out on the street, and anger will cause people to change how they behave. And I think the other thing that Sophia said that I think is really relevant is that you said in your little video that you didn't act when it was you, it was when it was somebody else. We're often motivated to act on behalf of someone else rather than ourselves. We'll put up with awful nonsense ourselves, but when we see that happening to someone else, and that is a form of action that is motivated by anger, and we know that that is implicated, that kind of sense of collective is implicated in terms of how people vote. So I think there is a whole political agenda that arises from trauma as well. I'm going to do a quick plug for the book. I have some copies in my bag if anybody wants a copy, but you can download it for free on that QR code, and I think I've run out of time.
First question to you, I've kind of gone on three themes here, but we have been talking about, if we look back at the rape crisis movement, it started way back in what we call second wave feminism, and of course one of the key mantras we got there was the personal is political, and I think that's partly what we're touching on today when we talk about disclosure and it being the whole of society that needs to be involved. So I want to ask you a little bit about that personal political and how that translates, and I suppose, Sophia, I start with you in terms of how you moved from that place where you were, as you said in the tape, you were unheard many times when you disclosed. You eventually moved from disclosure to advocacy. And I'm wondering, do you think of yourself as political when you did that? Or at what point did you think, I'm being really political?
I didn't think of it as being anything political at all. Like, one of my main reasons for coming forward is when it came to the stage where it went to court with my father, that's when I realised, oh God, this is serious, there's action being taken. And I done a lot of research online. I was looking for people that I could compare myself to, someone to reach out to, someone to talk to. And at the time, social media didn't have a presence, and I wasn't finding anybody or anything to talk to. But luckily, I was connected with an amazing counsellor, which was brilliant, because if I didn't have Sonia, I was hitting my head against a brick wall all the time. Like, even though I had amazing counsellor, I was still battling addiction, still battling my trauma. There was still so much going on. I lost all my immediate family, and as I said, if I didn't have Sonia, I wouldn't have had that nest to find safety in.
So when you went and started doing the podcast, what was going on for you there when you decided to do a podcast?
Proud. I was so proud, because another thing I wasn't prepared for is when I did go public is the messages. I was overwhelmed with the amount of people that reached out to me and said thank you for making me feel normal. A lot of people couldn't admit to loving their abuser or having feelings for their abuser, and to this day I still love my father. I'm going in to do restorative justice with him in December, and I'd done it before, and after I left the prison I was told he ended up paralysed in the hospital, because when I left everything with him. But I've done a lot more deeper healing on myself in the last year, and I've learned I dissociated so much as a child because I only felt the physical pain in my groin and my body about 4 or 5 months ago. And when I done the restorative justice, my father told me he didn't realise what he was doing was so bad, but now I've gone back and felt that pain. There's no way you didn't know you were doing that to a 2 or 3 or 4 year old little kid. And I want to go, and because I got such relief from the last restorative justice, I really feel like I need to go and give it all to him before I move on to the next chapter in my life, because also my mother has been sentenced in December, and that's 12 years of in and out the courtroom is finally finished.
and I can finally move on. Obviously, I've lost a lot in life, but I've also gained so much.
Yeah, thank you. And you really touched on, Orla, you were talking about connection. You've named so many people close to you there, and about those relationships moving in and out and how that matters and how that really impacted. And I suppose, Anne, just to ask you then, as someone who has been in rape crisis and in counselling, how does that translate, that piece where you're connecting people, connecting survivors to their communities, or how do we impact communities, go out there and give people like Sophia that safety net around them? How is the rape crisis movement and rape crisis in your experience doing that?
Easy question, thanks. Well, I suppose one of the first ways in which we do it is to go out and speak in the communities. Whether we do that, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. We do that in various different ways. We do it through RCI, obviously, at a national level, which is hugely important. But I think rape crisis centres have always been political activists, community activists, activists for survivors. And because our work touches across so many different even government departments would say, because obviously we've a huge involvement with the criminal justice system, but also in terms of mental health systems, in terms of medical profession, in terms of housing, education. It's like the breadth of, it shows, I suppose, the breadth of sexual violence. It touches or can touch every single part of a survivor's life, and therefore it touches every part of our societal life. And I suppose one of the things, and it's again going back to the database, that Mosaic has done for us is it has helped us show the depth and the breadth of the effects that sexual violence has, right through from political, right through to the whole of society. The cost in personal terms for survivors first and foremost, and also the cost that they bear then, as Sophia has talked about, in disclosing. But also, I suppose, the change that can generate, the change that us collecting their information has generated and continues to generate. One of the things, I suppose, that we've talked about as well is, for example, the Gardaí have changed how they work with survivors over the years. And that came directly from a report by Rape Crisis Network, as we were at the time, Ireland, Rape, Justice and the Law. And that's been a huge benefit to survivors, and also has encouraged more survivors to come forward, has improved reporting levels, has improved, I think, possibly conviction, although, you know, a lot more to do there. But yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah. No, but it's the whole of society piece, because, and I suppose turning to yourself, Professor Muldoon, you know, when Sophia, you said, well, I'm not really thinking of myself as political, but when we're looking at the public work you're doing, we're like, you're absolutely political. And I suppose one of the things you've looked at, Professor Muldoon, is how trauma is political, in terms of both how, you know, how it's expressed, but also how it impacts those who are carrying trauma. I wonder if you could say more on that.
Well, I guess political with a small p, maybe, rather than political Fianna Fáil versus whoever they're currently at loggerheads with. So I think it is political. It is political in the sense that the risk is linked to all sorts of political and social divisions. So that would be the first thing. It's political in terms of who's a victim and who's a perpetrator, and there's the whole issue of sort of patriarchal societies, which is of course a political setup, if you like, and who's protected in societies like that and who isn't. And I think one of the things I think that comes through very heavily in our research with victims of abuse in Ireland is that many people, many perpetrators are protected by our notion of family. So in one analysis we did, it was actually very clear that people assuming family relationships and cordial family relationships allowed children to be abused. So because there would be no questioning of a father's actions, it often, even in public spaces, children could be abused. So in that way it's political, but I think even though you don't see yourself as political, I do think that waiving anonymity is actually a political small p act. And I think when I listen to you and I hear you say things like, I've lost so much, but I've gained so much, that thing that you're gaining is actually often something political. Because whether or not you realise it, you are driving a social change agenda by your sense of responsibility to others, by your sense of connecting with other victims because you didn't have victims to connect to. Like, that's incredibly empowering for them, probably a little bit empowering for you. So to me that is all political, and it connects the personal experience that people have of trauma with how they go forward, and I think you're trying to make the world a better place.
Yes.
Not to make miscongeniality out of you, but do you know, I think that that's how it becomes political, and I think it's political in the sense of, like, there is this concept of post-traumatic growth, and I think that some of what Sophia is talking about is a kind of collective post-traumatic growth.
And it's like I spoke about, like, the difference between myself and my sister about talking about trauma. Like, I'm going to be dealing with my trauma for the rest of my life, and I'm okay with that because I'm picking up tools to use along the way to keep me well. But back to Sonia again, if I didn't have that place to find those tools, I honestly don't know how I would have coped through life. When I look at my sister, it was my sister's death that saved my life, that put me into recovery, because I didn't want to die from substance abuse, which I started to numb the pain that was created by the trauma that was given to me as a small kid. So it's like, it's a complete ripple effect. My daughter has lost out on so much of, she's 22 now, and she was 10, 11, 12 up until now. My mom's case is still going on. So she's lost out on so much of her childhood, because there's times where she had to mother me through life, and she the loss of my sister also. So like, she's lost out on so much because of what my father has done. And it's a ripple effect to so many people. My sister has 4 kids. Do you know, they're left without a mom because the decisions my father made to do what he done.
Yeah. And I think that you bring it nicely in terms of just focusing in on disclosure there, because, and Anne, I'm going to ask you that question of, because you went to counsellors, you took a number of steps before you found Sonia. You've mentioned Sonia a few times, your counsellor in rape crisis. As a counsellor in rape crisis, Anne, what is it that's distinct and different about rape crisis counselling? And is that piece of, it's the context, it's really understanding the community around a survivor as well, is that part of what's different?
I think so. I think it's the fact that we're survivor-centred. We're led and said by the survivors who come to us. They're the people we have learned the most from over the years. All the centres grew up in response to the needs of survivors within our communities. And we continue to develop in that regard as well. And I think it's the understanding of, I think the first thing, as I said before, a survivor needs is to be believed. To have their pain and their grief respected and held by somebody who also sees their strengths, sees the things that they have done that have helped them survive to this day. They may not have been, as Sophia said, some of the things that survivors do may not be they may not be healthy, they may not be good for them, but they got them too. And then to come in the door, as I said, is such an act of courage and resilience. And I think it's validating for survivors what their strengths are, and it's also then we know, and I've heard Sophia talking about some of the things within podcasts about the thing of still loving your father, for example. We know that that's normal and natural for survivors of sexual abuse, or can be. Do you know? And it's having that understanding within that space, I think, is yeah.
Absolutely, and I suppose one of the things that you know, the message today in terms of the database was we have these, you know, very high level assumptions, and we often hear them over and over again about what motivates survivors to talk and not to talk, and they're assumptions, and I think a lot of them are mistaken, because we need to really listen to survivors. We need to go out there. As I think I might have mentioned, you know, we need to be curious about the survivors who are not seeking support, because we need to ask, because they're probably innovating, they're probably building something around them. And if they can tell us that, maybe we can help replicate that and support that for the survivors. You know, the current pathways are not the only pathways. And when we're survivor-led, we go out, we talk to them, and we're curious, and we ask the questions. So we're really able to go to a new level of questions. And I really, you know, that piece of we can't be assuming anything. And that sort of brings me to my next question to yourself. In terms of evidence, if we're talking about the disclosure gap today, and we're saying really that disclosure gap is the evidence. So the question is, if it's the evidence, what is it the evidence of?
I think it's evidence of the fact that many people still blame themselves for their own victimization. And I think it was very clear in Sally's slides that there are people who think that because they were drunk, or because there was another one was drunk and one was something else on that slide, that somehow they are partly culpable. It wasn't serious enough was the other one, that it wasn't sufficiently bad. So I think one of the things that we know a lot of is that people self-stigmatise. And that's really, really how all these negative effects occur. That people internalise that somehow their victimisation was justified and justifiable. And if somehow you accept that, in part maybe because even the neighbours knew, or the rest of the family knew, and nobody did anything, because sometimes people know without someone having to disclose. So that people are complicit in the knowledge and know that it's there. So you somehow manage to convince yourself that therefore you are partly culpable. So why would you disclose? Sure, don't they all know anyway? And what is the point in coming forward? So I think that's very clear in the data that we have, that there are people who just don't think, or they've had a bad experience, they've told someone and they've been battered away, or not believed. So I think all of that leads to the self-stigma, and that closes down disclosure. I think the other thing that was really important in Sally's data was that 90% of people who had showed up had told someone. So my guess is that the people who don't show up told someone, and the someone said, "Oh, don't be making, what are you making big of that? I mean, you're making too much of that."
That leads me to my follow-on question for you, which is, you've been studying trauma for a long time, but obviously out there, you know, we're now, everyone's talking about trauma-informed everything. And sometimes we're going, what do you mean by that? Can we pin that down? You know, but it's very popular, let's say, right now, to be talking about trauma-informed. When in the years that you've been looking at this issue, can you say that something has changed? What is changing around how we are, you know, really approaching and really addressing trauma as a whole in society today that might be different, and what does that point us to, or where do you think we should be going in the future in terms of having a fully trauma-informed society?
I think there's probably more acceptance, that there was a lot of things have opened up. There is more acceptance. I would say that it hasn't opened up entirely. There's still many areas where we're not entirely happy about acknowledging that what was done was wrong. I do think that we're a more open society. I am concerned about the trauma-informed thing, because I think sometimes it's used to pathologize people. So instead of saying, here's somebody with agency that's coming through, that it's somehow used to pigeonhole people as problematic or traumatized. So I am a little bit wary of it. So I guess one of the things that I hope is happening in the wake of COVID is that the idea that everything is about personal agency is going to go away, and we're going to see that people can only come forward and have agency when the system allows them. So that notion that it's up to us rather than up to Sophia, that it's up to us all to facilitate a more open society, rather than survivors to have to do it all on their own. That would be where I think we should go, but I wouldn't have confidence yet.
I think the rape crisis movement, if I can be so bold, I think we're with you there in terms of it's a collective responsibility around change. Sophia, if I can come back to you just for a final piece, because I think, you know, the journey you're on, you're still on that journey, but, you know, we started with the feminist mantra of the personal is political, but another piece of really important feminist wisdom from that is that self-care is political. So do you want to tell us where your next steps are?
My next step is I'm going moving to Bali for a year on the 23rd of December. Yeah, I'll have my mum's sentencing, the restorative justice done, and it was a last minute thing a couple of months ago. Myself and my partner said, you know what, we're just going to go and find ourselves. And Peter has his own story with recovery and stuff, and we've both been doing so much inner work on ourselves this last year. We're like, let's go. Wow. Let's go find our true, authentic selves.
I think it speaks for us all. I love the agency. I love the way you're taking a hold of that. Yeah. Anne, can I end with you then? And I suppose another easy question. Yeah, you've been, and I to be honest, I've forgotten how long, but you've been a very long time. Maybe I shouldn't name the length of time in the sector. And you've seen a lot of change. There has been a lot of change. You know, sometimes we can be pessimistic, but actually huge change has happened in this area. If we're looking at that disclosure gap, as I say, it's evidence that we still have work to do. If we're looking at 5-10 years ahead, knowing we can change, what does that change look like in 5 years? What's your hope for where we get to in 5-10 years?
My hope would be that it's the shame piece. I think is huge. The shame and the stigma still around sexual violence. Those myths and those false beliefs have been in place for centuries, and so obviously we don't get to change that overnight. But what I see more of is particularly maybe for young women coming in, they don't see themselves as being to blame for. Now I'm talking about sexual assault or rape that happens to them as young adults. That's very different for people who've experienced sexual violence as children. But that's one of the things that I see changing. So I think it's that whole piece. I think it's the bit about we need to start talking to our children younger about sexual violence, about consent, about consent maybe in a different way, if you know what I mean. I think we need to be empowering around that. I gave a disclosure workshop in the South East University a couple of weeks ago, and afterwards one of the participants, who was a man, came up to me and he said to me, really, we're the problem, aren't we? And I think it's that bit that men really need to start getting involved, and we need to start empowering them to really take a stand against sexual violence, because it exists on a spectrum from sexist, demeaning jokes right through to the sexual violence. So that's, I'd love to see all of that. If you can put that in place over the next 5 years, that'd be great.
Brilliant. Thank you all. And before I wrap up, and one of the reasons I wanted to give Anne the last word here is because I want to take this opportunity, if I can. So Anne doesn't know about this, and you won't be able to tell from looking at her, but Anne is actually at retirement age. So this is actually one of her last events with us in her position as both our chairperson and as manager of Waterford Rape Crisis Centre. As I said, she's given decades as a volunteer, as an activist, as a counsellor, as a manager, and indeed on the RCI board as well. And we couldn't have had someone just who has guided us. I was thinking the other day, what is the key bit about Anne Scully? And for us, for me, I have to say, having Anne on our board, what Anne always brought was she made everything really simple. And what I mean by that is when we're dealing with really complex, probably governance issues, and in this area there's often complex questions, Anne was the one who was always able to bring it right back to the survivor and to the really, really ethical place, and to make everything really simple, because once you're back there, the decisions are always simple. And Anne always managed to see through the complexity to the survivor and what needed to be done. So we will certainly miss you in your roles, but I know we're not letting you go. But like Sophia, we want to wish you the very best in the next phase of your life, and just taking a hold of that and taking control of that, and just living and just having a really just fulfilling all the potential. So thank you all very much, and Professor Muldoon as well. So that's it from us. Thank you.